Tonight on the Core of the Law, Elder Scrolls Online, critiquing the critics. There is a considerable amount of skepticism about Elder Scrolls Online. This is partly due to the fact that we have very little information about it compared to other MMOs this close to release. Parallels between Elder Scrolls Online and Star Wars: The Old Republic are frequent. However, there are a number of flaws with such comparisons. Though I've been skeptical of this project from the very beginning, and I agree that ZeniMax have yet to really prove themselves, however, from the information available we can say a few things about a lot of the parallels and arguments doing the rounds on the forums. Questing and structure. Like the single-player games, Elder Scrolls Online is going for a non-linear approach to adventuring in the open world. We know that quests will be triggered by finding various objects, discovering hidden dungeons, coming across certain NPCs. In many respects, the parallel that Elder Scrolls Online draws is not with the Old Republic, but rather with the Secret World. In that MMO, questing is handled through chains of quests. You pick up a quest somewhere, you complete it in a certain other location, and then you find evidence that leads to a different quest, and so on and so forth, taking you throughout the open world, somewhat in a circle. Sometimes you'll end up back at the very point where all the questing began, usually one of the major hubs. This is how most of the story is presented in the Secret World. Though bookended by cutscenes and occasionally in instanced off areas, most of it occurs in the open world and involves the interactive gameplay mechanics. Unlike the almost entirely instant personal stories of Guild Wars 2 or the class quests of the Old Republic, events and stories are triggered by player actions, not just by clicking on one NPC after another, leading to some of the best questing I've ever seen in an MMO. It is a very difficult balancing act trying to get the kind of experiences you can get through single-player gameplay with the needs of a shared open world. Many MMOs essentially take the easy route and instance everything. Other MMOs like Guild Wars 2 try to come up with dynamic events where some of the story can be told in the open world, shared with other players, though they still have to resort to putting most of the story in instances. So the Secret World's use of open world in storytelling is very similar to that of the Elder Scrolls single-player games, and so it makes sense to implement it in the Elder Scrolls Online. Also, like the Secret World, NPC interaction has voiceover, but only for the NPCs, not for your character. This seems to be done through cruder NPC interaction screens than the kind of cutscenes you get in the Old Republic or in the Secret World, but there does seem to be an element of choice and decision making involved, connected to the story. Although how much impact this may have for the development of your character and for the story and for open world interaction has yet to be seen. Subscription, free-to-play, cash shops, etc. One of the most understandable criticisms is that because the Elder Scrolls Online is going for subscription, this will alienate a great many of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One players who are either not used to subscribing to games or will object because they are already being charged for access to their console's online services. However, there is a counter effect, mainly from PC gamers, that will result not necessarily in a disastrous launch or not enough people subscribing after a certain period of time, resulting in the usual subscription drop-off that we see, but may simply result in the actual bulk of the player base shifting from a console audience to a PC audience, as there are a great many PC gamers already fed up with being nickel and dimed from free-to-play MMOs. It is quite possible that the PvP and PvE may be good enough for enough subscribers, although a subscription can now come off as cynical and insincere, given that it may not be planned to last for more than 6 months. The main problem is that it doesn't really fit the IP, given that the single player games will buy to play, and also that Guild Wars 2 demonstrated how quickly you could produce extra content with a buy-to-play model. So even if ZeniMax think that they can justify a subscription with fast content updates, people will still be able to point to Guild Wars 2 and say that content updates alone are not sufficient. However, in turn, people will be able to point out that at least when playing Elder Scrolls Online, you are not constantly inconvenienced by a lack of bag space or the need to fork out extra money for a new character. Voiceovers. Although Elder Scrolls Online can indeed boast that its NPCs are fully voiced, unlike the Old Republic, these interactions are basically quick, short conversation screens, or the NPCs talk while the player character is able to move around, and the player is still interacting rather than passively watching a cutscene. Again, more reminiscent of the Secret World. Which brings us to budget. It was later revealed that a significant cause for the inflated budget of the Old Republic was not the voiceover work, but rather that they had huge trouble adapting the engine for use in an MMO. In a great many human endeavours, it is the unexpected expenditures, not the ones known from the start and planned for, that can be the biggest drain on the resources. Having the player character talk was also a significant increase in the budget, and the Elder Scrolls Online does not have to start from scratch with an engine, as it is working off single-player games that are being developed more recently. Of course, we do not really know what the budget for the Elder Scrolls Online is, and there could be all sorts of problems going on behind the scenes, resulting in higher costs than are planned. But it is pure speculation to insist upon parallels for this reason. Endgame. Unlike with the Old Republic, the Elder Scrolls Online seems to be going for PvP as its main focus for Endgame. Now, although there is going to be PvE adventure zones and also the ability for level 50 characters to explore the zones of the other two factions, PvP is a huge part of the lore and the political structure of Tamriel. Much of the game has been built around this endgame. So even though with the Elder Scrolls Online there is still questions about how good the endgame will be, whether the game will stand or fall on that very important characteristic of an MMO, we know that there's at least one area in which endgame is not an afterthought, as it appeared to be for the BioWare developers of the Old Republic. Although I do think that ZeniMax are leaving it rather late to give us any real details on endgame PvE. Is there going to be as much and as high a quality of content for exploring the other two factions' zones as a level 50 character as there are for exploring within your own faction? Have they put as much thought into the adventure zones as, say, Carbine have with WildStar's endgame raiding? One other distinction for endgame is that your character in the Elder Scrolls Online has many forms of progression which go far beyond the actual level, including class skills, weapon-specific skills, and skills that you can develop as a result of becoming, for example, a werewolf or joining certain guilds. Relying on a big IP and what it means for expectations. From the start of the game's announcement, ZeniMax certainly seemed to be relying a lot on the fact that this was Elder Scrolls Online, rather than giving us a list of features that would give us reasons to be excited for the game itself, as ArenaNet did with Guild Wars 2 and Carbine are doing with WildStar. But the main problem is the fact that the single-player games have a very hardcore following. People who expect certain features, the combat to feel a certain way, the environments to be open or immersive or realistic, graphics to be of a certain quality, NPCs to be able to act in certain ways, with AI and scripted behaviours that improve with each successive single-player game. Elder Scrolls Online, being online, will have to make certain compromises to character models, for example, or to combat mechanics due to latency. And many players of the single-player games will at first be quite appalled at the kinds of changes and compromises that will have had to have been made, possibly resulting in them no longer playing past a few hours so that they do not see the big picture, such as PvP or Endgame, or larger group content, not to mention the in-game economy. Though the Old Republic's Star Wars IP was bigger than Elder Scrolls, it did not necessarily generate specific expectations as to what the game should be like, but Elder Scrolls Online has recent single-player games to live up to, which is virtually impossible for an MMO. To a certain extent, this is due to actual gameplay mechanics necessary for an MMO to be able to function, but in other respects it's a current technological problem. The polygon counts of character models and environments limited for frame rates, and various ways of interacting with the world that are limited due to broadband speeds, particularly in America. Though not every difference between Elder Scrolls Online and the single-player games can be so understandably explained, hopefully ZeniMax will listen to criticisms in those areas where their hands are not so tied. The Old Republic was often called by critics Tortanic, given that it seemed to be a vast lumbering machine incapable of moving out of the way, in other words, innovating or responding to players' recommendations. ZeniMax, at least in this area, appear to be capable of more manoeuvring, at least judging from the additions of the compass and first-person combat. This may help with the next issue, the developers' lack of experience. The Old Republic was BioWare's first MMO, and this did show with a number of the mistakes that they made with the initial state of the game at launch, not to mention how they tried to maintain the subscription, Endgame, and of course a great deal of the controversies regarding the free-to-play conversion. Although it can be said that ZeniMax do have experienced MMO developers among them, the same could also have been said for BioWare. But you only have to look at Sony Online Entertainment's checkered history with some of its titles to see that it's not necessarily about the experience the company as a whole may have with MMOs, but all the other factors which we can see lead to certain MMOs being either disastrous or disappointing. ZeniMax will make mistakes, and some of them will be connected to their lack of experience, and I guess we will not know until after the dust has settled whether or not a disaster has occurred, and what are the chief responsible factors. Single player and MMO comparisons. We have already dealt with how Elder Scrolls Online will have to live in the shadow of the single player games. However, as this is an MMO, pretty much, it would be best to try side-by-side comparisons with other specific MMO titles. MMO players want many different things and are not interested in excuses. For example, there have been people who are calling for total open world PvP, where all three factions can visit each other's territory for PvP when leveling up, for both defenders and invaders, as this is a common feature of many faction-based MMOs. However, this would interfere with the whole point of Elder Scrolls Online, which is that they are attempting to replicate the leveling up, questing and exploration experience of the single-player games, combined with an MMO-like social experience. It would be very difficult to arrange things so that players could experience the scripted exploration and quest chain-based content in anything like the way it is in single-player games, and so PvP is limited to Cyrodiil. It is an understandable compromise given the IP, but certain MMO players want what they want. This of course is the reverse of the single-player Elder Scrolls fans that are going to be disappointed with the compromises made for the sake of maintaining an online experience. I do not envy the balancing act that ZeniMax have to perform. When compared to other major MMOs, The Elder Scrolls Online does, at least on paper, look pretty good, particularly if you are tired of the usual combat mechanics and quest hub gameplay. Rift, for example, at least for the first 50 levels, has the same old WoW style questing, as well as the same combat. Dynamic events at least helped break up some of the monotony, as does the very open progression system. Elder Scrolls Online is going for a similar approach to dynamic events, although limited, as they won't be able to interfere in the quest structure of the open world any more than PvP can. Elder Scrolls Online's combat is more similar to Terra's or Neverwinter's. Terra is more dedicated to action combat, but is let down by its gameplay, particularly the way that NPCs and questing is handled. Both the Secret World and Guild Wars 2 go for a hybrid combat system that is partly action-based and partly more traditional. The problem is that this results in a very fast-paced combat that nonetheless requires slightly more intense use of the keyboard and mouse that can become quite uncomfortable. Speaking from personal experience, I prefer purer action combat, as it is a lot more intuitive and the streamlined character and camera controls are easier on the wrists. Taking everything into consideration, it looks like at this point that the Elder Scrolls Online is at least adequate, if not pretty good, in a large number of different areas, but doesn't have any single serious flaw, as Rift does in its combat and questing, Terra in its questing, the Secret World and Guild Wars 2 somewhat in the combat, and certainly seems to be superior to the Old Republic when it comes to its use of the open world. It does, however, appear to have lots and lots of little problems which will annoy both the single-player Elder Scrolls fans and MMO players in general. Although of course this is very subjective, there are always issues which might not bother most people, but for others is the single game-breaking point in which they will have to quit. I might find something like that in the game, although this could still possibly be the first MMO I am able to play in a long time until I get sick of it. Co-op. One issue that needs to be addressed is that a great many single-player Elder Scrolls fans repeatedly requested a co-op option for their game and weren't necessarily asking for an MMO. I would have certainly have thought that that would have been much less of a headache to develop and maintain. But who knows what is going on inside ZeniMax Online's collective heads. Given what I have experienced as a beta tester and MMO player for over a decade, I certainly would not want to be an MMO developer for anything. We MMO players are a psychotically demanding bunch, who think we can develop an MMO better than developers can. And unfortunately for our egos, occasionally we are right. Anybody that was in the beta for Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 knows what I mean. Marketing. This is certainly one area where ZeniMax's behaviour baffles me. I understand that you want to avoid the mistake that BioWare made with the Old Republic, which was that they continually hyped up the game, releasing video after video and article after article for over 3 years before the game even came out. The upside of it is that those of us which were obsessively devouring all this material could tell that it was going to be a rather underwhelming game long before it came out and saved ourselves the money. I am of course lying, I got it anyway because I can never resist a new shiny MMO. Under-marketing an MMO is certainly a new one, at least for a project this high profile. History is certainly littered with the wrecks of many MMOs that were not marketed correctly or under-marketed. Let's have a moment of silence for Gods and Heroes. Never heard of it? That is my point. There are certainly many people who are frustrated with ZeniMax's reluctance to talk about adventure zones, especially this close to launch. Let us look at two of the best marketing strategies for an MMO, that of Guild Wars 2 and WildStar. In both cases, you could tell exactly what the features were, what the tone of the games were, because the developers made it abundantly clear what to expect. The painted beauty of Guild Wars 2, accompanied by Jeremy Soul's incredible music, and the way WildStar pulls you into its animated world. The features carefully laid out by the developers were very good sound bites, easy to repeat to your friends and to doubters on internet forums. And in the case of Carbine's WildStar, the dev videos and highly amusing animated videos are hard to ignore and get the point across. And get Jeremy Soule to do the music for any game, and I will simply buy it on principle. Although some of the videos released by ZeniMax do fit the dark or realistic tone, many of the early videos in particular failed to evoke that Elder Scrolls feel because of the lack of first-person combat and gameplay. The poor quality of the QuakeCon footage also doesn't help. And there's also the issue that when people have a negative experience in the beta, they're more inclined to break NDA, and therefore we tend to get only bad news from beta players. ZeniMax are going to have to release a rather impressive series of videos within the next month and a half. For the past year, I've been in rather an unusual position in that my interest in the game has been due to the fact that the developers failed to hype me for it. This led to me being rather curious about the game, but also puzzled. It is only because of a recent experience that I am neither allowed to confirm or deny, let alone give any details on, that my position has changed and I am now far more interested. Beforehand, I was only really interested in the game's lore due to the incredibly good YouTube series by the Shoddycast. Sandbox and Theme Park. The single-player Elder Scrolls games are seen as sandboxes in the sense that you can go where you want, do what you want, it's very unlinear, and your character development is very open. There's also ways of permanently changing aspects of the world, and of course, player-made houses were introduced in one of Skyrim's expansions. The problem is that a lot of the actual leveling and questing content isn't really compatible with a sandbox in the sense of Ultima Online or Worm Online, or of course Eve, where the majority of the content is made by the players. Elder Scrolls Online was always going to have a significant percentage of theme park developer-based content. The question is, why didn't ZeniMax also give us the tools to make our own content as Cryptic did with Neverwinter's Foundry system? I haven't the faintest idea, and it puzzles me. True, a degree of content will be affected by the players with the Cyrodiil-based PvP, but that is true of all MMOs no matter how theme park they are if there's any degree of PvP content. This is just slightly more open world, with buildings and territories more permanently affected by player actions. That is not Sandbox in the sense that the single-player games are. Of course, we have EverQuest Next Landmark for that kind of content, but it would have been nice to do that kind of thing in Tamriel as well as Nora. I personally do not think how theme parks are really a good economic strategy, given that the developers, particularly when the game first comes out, have to bend over backwards to try to produce as much content as possible as fast as possible. I remember the shock of realizing that it had taken me less than 3 weeks to experience all of the content of Star Trek Online when it launched. This of course was a sharp contrast with my experience previously in Eve, but for me the best kind of sandbox experience would be seen in something like Worm Online, where your character has the ability to influence, change, shape, destroy, build every single thing around them. Every tree can be chopped down, every piece of dirt can be dug up. And once you appreciate the amount of hard work it takes to gather resources and build things, there is something truly awe-inspiring about wandering through a vast city or complex built by the players. Though WildStar is giving us a token amount of sandbox content using the plug and socket technology, that game is still at its heart a theme park, especially when you compare it to what Sony Online Entertainment are doing with EverQuest Next. But I suppose there is some justice to SOE being the first to develop a true AAA sandbox this decade, after all the mistakes they made with Star Wars Galaxies. So I think we can put this down to a wasted opportunity, not only for the players, but also for the developers, given that the subscription ties them to having to make a large amount of content fairly quickly. Giving us the developer tools in the way that Sony Online Entertainment have done would have taken a huge amount of that pressure off. Maybe we should have more faith in the developers. Maybe the combination of the kind of questing content that they're going for, which is a good method, and the PvP will somehow combine together into an overall good experience that's maybe even better than many other MMOs. I have no doubt that it will, at least compared to the Old Republic, be a solid MMO. But again, look at all the MMO and single player Elder Scrolls fans who probably won't be satisfied no matter what ZeniMax do at this point. And certainly ZeniMax have not really done all that much to justify having any faith in them. Even if you're the kind of MMO player that enjoys theme park content and doesn't necessarily yearn for a sandbox renaissance, nonetheless it is undeniable that the theme park model is largely economically unsustainable for a lot of developers. Rift had a huge amount of content updates very fast, and it still failed to maintain its subscription system. Even if a free-to-play conversion from many MMOs brings in loads of new players, they often end up losing a lot of the old ones, because many free-to-play models can come off as extremely greedy, desperate, obnoxious, inconvenient. It wouldn't be necessary to have such cash shop controversy if developers were able to produce more content and keep more people entertained at a lower price. It doesn't get much cheaper than nothing, which is what you get with developer tools given to the players. I really have not come across a single argument in favour of a pure theme park model. So this is one area where I cannot see any flaws in the criticisms of a lack of good sandbox features. And now we come to the most important area, lore. Like the Old Republic, the Elder Scrolls Online is set before the most well-known time periods. However, the Old Republic was also in a sense a sequel to the single-player games that came before it, and could somewhat continue the stories of those games. Elder Scrolls Online is set long before the single-player games, and also controversially retcons a lot of the history in order to generate the 3 rival factions that it needs. This is most obvious in the Ebonheart Pact, where you have Argonians and Dark Elves working together, despite the fact that both before this and after they have a bitterly antagonistic relationship as enslaved and enslavers. There are 2 points, however, that could be said in favour of this rewrite. Firstly, it actually does fit the overall pattern of Elder Scrolls lore, that there may be mistakes and misinterpretations and gaps missing in the records, due to the fact, of course, that the single-player games were made many years apart by slightly different teams that had to strewn the open world areas with loads and loads of books and lore, but also because you've got different factions telling their own versions of history. It is after all a slogan that we hear in the Elder Scrolls Online videos that there is no single truth about the world. It's certainly a contrast from just looking things up in the Silmarillion if you want to understand things about Middle-earth. But there's also the issue of story potential. One of the reasons why I object to characters being killed off at times in certain stories and television programs and movies is that in many cases those characters were a major source of entertainment but also story ideas. For the sake of a dramatic plot twist, a location or a character or set of characters can be killed off, but then you're left with less stories to tell, particularly if those characters had unique situations or relationships that perpetually generated new story ideas. In this case we have the reverse. We have new characters, new locations, new factions, and other complex interacting components that generate a huge amount of stories, enough to fill an entire MMO and all its expansions. And at the end of the day, isn't telling stories ultimately what all this is about? In conclusion, I would say that we have reasons to be hopeful, reasons to be disappointed, reasons to be doubtful, but above all, we can at least say that we will have new adventures, new places to explore, new books to read, and new people to meet and create stories with. This is the core of the lore finally shutting up.